My name is Aisha. I am a first-year MBA candidate at Sloan. And next up, we have Coy Stefanos.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Coy Stefanos. I'll be presenting our research using hex maps to classify and cluster dribble handoff variants in the NBA. Not with me here today are my co-authors, Drs. Gate Husari, Brian Bennett, Professor Matthew Harrison, and my wife, Emma Stefanos. So let's get into it. Hopefully this is a review for everybody here, but basketball is a team sport in which two teams compete to score baskets. Now strategy in basketball can be pretty difficult because even adept players miss the majority of their shots. You know, Steph Curry's only missed 58% of his threes, right? So strategy is often revolves around trying to find those valuable opportunities, spaces, cracks in the defense where we can expose them, and so trying to look at actions, their impact on sort of non-scoring, but the other assets is really quite valuable. As a result, there's been quite a bit of work on play classification, action classification with this type of data, and automating it, trying to distill those things as quickly as possible. So we set out to try to build an automated pipeline that is capable of detecting, pulling out the things that we care about, and then learning in a bottom-up, unbiased approach what the emerging patterns within those data sets are. So in particular, we looked at dribble handoffs. Now, much of the existing research focuses on a similar on-ball action, the on-ball screen, commonly referred to as a pick and roll, which is actually one of its more frequently used variants. Now, this is useful because both on-ball screens and dribble handoffs have similar targeting and pattern analysis. We have an approach stage, we have an execution stage, we have screening and cutting rolls, and we can see below how similar both of them look. On the left, we have an on-ball screen, a pick and roll action, and on the right, we have a similar variant dribble handoff, in which the only real difference in this example is the ball handler. So the ball handler in an on-ball screen is your cutting player. They are approaching the screen, driving around it, potentially passing a little dump-off pass to the screener as they roll towards the basket. In a dribble handoff, the screening player is actually the ball handler in the approach stage. They approach the screen point, set a screen, intending to place themselves in between the defensive player guarding the cutting player, creating as much space in that moment, and then a handoff sometimes occurs in which the ball is exchanged, the cutting player receives it, either drives towards the basket, pulls up for a three-point shot, tries to hit an off-ball player. One of those typically. Now, like I said, you don't actually have to have a handoff in a dribble handoff. As a matter of fact, you're better off implementing a variety of fakes as part of a cohesive strategy. And fakes are very useful, especially with sort of modern defenses where we switch a lot. We sort of try to anticipate that switch. We'll slip screens and stuff. So a fake dribble handoff can be very useful. As we can see, no pass actually occurs in this example. The screening player comes up, sets the screen. The defense may be anticipating this, and so they cut towards the basket really quickly, effectively slipping out of that screen and potentially getting an open layup. Now, intentionally diverting from patterns is very useful for strategy when you're trying to confuse other players. It can, however, be pretty difficult for a machine learning model to then pick up on that because the patterns that you're trying to isolate and look for are intentionally not happening. So let's take a look at a couple of film examples just to see how this stuff plays out. Now in this first example, we'll look at a Charlotte Hornets offensive set. Now we're actually going to have a couple off-ball screens that are happening, the dribble handoff on the top of the key, and we're going to approach, exchange in a pretty typical fashion, and then we're actually going to hit a backdoor cut. Malik Monk's going to get a nice little dunk out of this. So we can see the space that's created in a valuable location. Now, moving on, we're going to have two right here, back to back. So first, we're going to have a fake dribble handoff, followed immediately by a real handoff. So Embiid is going to approach the screening location. They fake the handoff, confuses the defense for just a second to get the real handoff off, get a little bit of window, and then sharpshooter J.J. Redick is going to knock that down. So those are a couple different ways that it can be used within an offense. So a couple of the issues in trying to classify it. First off, the complexity of the data. We are capturing coordinates for all 10 players on the court, as well as the ball and the refs, actually, 25 times per second. So you have a lot of very granular data. On top of that, it doesn't really have everything that we'd like. We'd love to see the orientation of the arms, if they're watching the ball, if they're watching somebody else, but unfortunately we get a little pinpoint for every little point. So we don't really have that kind of broader context, or at least we have to try to extract it out of the raw data as much as possible. Next, we have a wide range of variants. So plays can end early, they can go poorly, especially with modern read and react offenses. We are intentionally trying to appraise on the fly and make those decisions without a huge amount of forward-looking intention. And then fake actions being one of those variants can be quite difficult because you're looking for a pass and there is no pass. It can be a little confusing, especially to a model that doesn't have our human vision. So with that said, we'll try to get into the actual pipeline architecture that we proposed to try to distill these actions into something that can be used for broader analysis. So we use the SportView player tracking data set, fairly ubiquitous within, hopefully everybody here knows what I'm talking about. So we're just going to sort of move past that player tracking data. And so that is combined with some event label data and passed into the first of 3 stages within our pipeline, in which we perform some pre-processing and use a rule-based candidate algorithm to try to pull out potential dribble handoffs from the raw data. So these are essentially candidates that can then be passed off into stage 2, in which manual labeling occurs to build and train the initial classification model. We generate features in this step, and we do the hex bin conversions as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Now in stage 3, once we have a trained model, we can then begin automating. We can pass unlabeled data, have the model apply on that unlabeled data, and then once we have those positive instances, actual dribble handoffs that we care about from the games, we can then cluster those in a bottom-up deep learning approach, which allows us to detect those emerging patterns and potentially find little cracks that we can optimize within our strategy. So drilling into that pipeline a little bit more, first up at the pre-processing. So we filter events based on type, and we remove anything with compromised coordinate data. So occasionally you'll see Tyson Chandler take a pull-up 3, and that's probably an issue with mismatching. So next we try to determine possession, directionality, trim coordinate data, eliminate as much of the noise as possible. So we're looking at ideally just the little segment that we care about. And then the candidate algorithm comes in. We use a series of rules, essentially looking for the dynamics and spacing and timing that occur in these actions to try to pull out those samples. Now, for the sake of research, we imposed a somewhat artificial 90% recall, meaning that we optimized the candidate algorithm until 90% of the dribble handoffs that we were personally identified within watched footage were collected by, and then we moved on to the next step, which is the human labeling stage. In this stage, we manually reviewed broadcast recordings of 43 games spanning all 29 teams, except for Toronto, and over 400 players. Of this, we collected almost 3,400 candidates, and those were used to train the initial classification model. Now, part of that step is the Hex Map Encoding. So sort of Kurt Goldsberry is famous for using the hex maps for shot locations. So we tried to use a similar methodology to represent player movements. Now, this is done by essentially creating buckets or cell locations on the court and taking raw positional coordinates, placing them into those buckets, and then color coding based off of how long they spent in those individual cells. So we can see here in the red, we have the cutting player, and the greens, we have the screening player, and the short snippet of blue is the actual pass exchange that occurs at the handoff time. So this is valuable in that it allows us to abstract some of the precision from the raw data, get it a little bit less noisy, have it reflect the actual dynamics of the action that we care about. That way we can feed that into our models later on to get some interesting insights. So moving on to feature generation, we propose 50 unique features for the classification in this approach. 16 of those are engineered, meaning there's a little bit of work involved. These are things like trying to determine whether we're in a fast break scenario, in which case you're less likely to have set offense, or if we're coming out of an out-of-bounds play, in which case you're more likely to have a set offense and see some of those actions play out. In addition, we have 34 extracted features. These are largely about sort of spacing dynamics, so how fast the player was moving, how far they were away from the screening player when the pass occurred, et cetera. So we take all those features from the approach and execution stages that we saw before, and we also look at the start of the sequence, end of the sequence, when the pass occurs, the screen moments, and take all of that information for each candidate, take it into the classification models, which we'll take a look at now. So in order to train and test our models, we split the data set either 80-20 or 70-30, depending on the model in question. The 80 to 70%, the training is used for the model to essentially learn those underlying patterns and try to figure out how to discern in between positive and negative instances. And then the remaining is used to test so we can iteratively optimize those models, get them performing as well as possible. Now, in order to do this effectively, we have to take any non-numeric features and encode them. So there's some basic encoding. For example, player archetypes that are found in the source data, markers like guard, center forward. We actually take all the permutations of those, essentially assign a number, and we have something resembling the 1 to 5 point guard center type of deal, except a little bit broader. And next, we take the actual cell coordinates, so those hexagons, we sort them based off of Euclidean distance and assign them cell names, so we can actually reference those in a bit of a strategic way so that similar places on the court are represented similarly. Finally, we use min-max scaling, so any large numbers don't dwarf any small numbers when it comes to impact on the model's performance. Next, we looked at how our features actually contributed to that model performance using a metric called information gain. Here we can see the engineered features stack up quite well against a large amount of the extracted features, with some of the standouts being the actual location, the amount of distance that the screener actually moved on the approach stage, stuff like that. So moving on, comparing the actual performance of these models, we trained a variety of different models. We're going to look at two specifically, one representing sort of classical approaches, which is a support vector machine, frequently used in research to look at on-ball screens, and the second one, a neural network multi-layer perceptron. Now, looking at sort of standard accuracy metrics like precision recall and F1 score, which is a composite representing the relationship between positive and negatives and false positives and false negatives, we can see that the support vector machine actually outperforms the neural network by about 2 points on average, which is kind of interesting because if we look at AUC, which is area under the curve, we actually see kind of a different story. So the chart on the bottom, that red dotted line, effectively represents a model that is just guessing randomly. And the blue line represents the SVM on the left and the neural network on the right. And at about 20 points better, that difference between the blue line and the red line is effectively how well we discern in between those positive and negative samples. So because of the recall optimization of the candidate algorithm, it's quite possible that the support vector machine is doing a little bit better with the easy examples, but the neural network is actually doing a little bit better at discerning. So with a larger data sample, something much bigger than 43 games ideally, you would expect it to actually catch and eventually outperform the classical machine learning model. Next, we can look at the actual clusters. So this is sort of the meat of what we're trying to get to, is that bottom-up approach to try to find those emerging patterns in approach and executions. So we take the actual hex map encodings, we convert them to a flat vector matrix. Now, these are quite big and can be very difficult to process. They also contain quite a large amount of white space. So we use principal component analysis as a means of dimensionality reduction. So we can take the hex map encodings and turn them into these nice little bite-sized kernel pieces for, in this case, a k-means deep learning clustering model to do its thing. We use elbow plot and silhouette scores to determine the ideal amount of clusters at 9. Clusters are actually formed around centroids, which we're actually seeing here. Those are the centroids for each of the 9 clusters, and optimized to maximize density, the idea being that we want our clusters to be tightly representative so everything looks like each other and they don't look so much like other clusters. Now, if we actually look drilling in a little bit deeper, obviously we can see in the centroids a pattern in different cell locations and the trajectory angles of cutting players and whatnot. If we actually look at the breakdown by screener, we can see something kind of interesting, that 8, we actually have the majority of our screeners are guards. And this makes sense. These are a lot of instigating actions. So Curry's the best at this. He'll dribble it up, immediately give up possession, and start running curl screens around the back. So that's a great way to sort of trigger an offensive sequence. And it shows that our clusters are not only discerning between these sort of court locations, but also the roles of the players and the way that strategy influences. So finally, we'll take a look at some cluster profiles for various players. Now, up top, we have cutting players, and on the bottom, we have screening players. Now, what's kind of neat here is that we have those base designations from the data set. So here, Chris Paul, Damian Lillard are both G for guard, but we can see how different those profiles actually look, which, if you're an NBA junkie, you would expect, because Chris Paul is, point guard. He is the traditional pass-first, mid-range assassin, whereas Damian Lillard is going to pull up from 37 feet, and then he's going to dunk on you. So you wouldn't really expect them to have very similar patterns, despite the fact that they have a very top level, the same designation. Now, similarly, we can see that Kobe Bryant has sort of more similarities to Lillard than to Paul, and that makes sense since he is the Mamba, he's going to score. We don't actually see the peak in 8. He's actually not present there, which makes sense. He's not very frequently the primary bring the ball up the court, pass it off to start the execution. He's typically going to start on a wing and then come up and collect it. Now on the bottom, we can see those screening roles. Chris Bosh, our sort of dynamic playmaking forward, Tyson Chandler, our traditional center, and then Anthony Davis being kind of that tweener, do everything big, has a bit of the interplay, kind of a mismatch between the two of those. So this helps us to better identify the roles that players have in offenses. So the first thing when I talk to like my family and stuff about this, they always ask is like, so can I use this for gambling? Which, effectively, yes. But the idea is that it's a platform that you can do a lot of stuff with. So we can look at off-ball player movements. We can look at the defensive player movements. We can layer on, court realty metrics to try to determine the delta and advantage creation for primary instigating actions. We can layer on natural language processing or even genetic optimization to try to up those classifiers and get more interesting results. So ultimately, it's really about what your goals are, and our pipeline is intended to create a means where we can distill very complicated raw data into something that can be tangibly used for any type of analysis that you're looking for. So with that said, I will turn it over to questions. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate that presentation. Very nice. So I just want to make sure I understand completely. The classification model was not a convolutional, spatial, or it was just the features, basically a regression.
Yeah, for the most part, we used a bunch of different classification models. We were kind of intending to use something different than a convolutional network. So that's typically how they're sort of doing the precision abstraction for a lot of this stuff, whether you're looking, depending on whether you're clustering or classifying. So we were trying to basically do a different strategy by using hex maps as a way of maybe better representing. So, a neural network is kind of a black box, so we wanted to have a little bit more less opaqueness, I guess, in that process.
Yeah. One thing I didn't quite follow, you labeled each hexagon and then sorted them in distance. I didn't quite follow how that...
Yeah, so we have a bunch of cell locations, and we want to use the actual cells that they're in. So let's say the screen occurs in this cell, right? So we want to be able to pass that off to the machine learning model, and we want to do that in such a way where this cell is actually representative of other sort of cells. So we break the whole, essentially half-court set, like you saw, into those cell locations, and then we assigned we basically wrote a script to determine how far away they were, and they named them sort of accordingly. So your names are more similar closer on the court. So that way they would be able to feed in those raw points as the cell locations, and a machine learning model would be able to determine, if you started in one cell over as opposed to 2 cells over, that information is going to look very similar as opposed to, just a XY coordinate, which might be a little less so.
Okay. All right. I'm scared to ask this question because I think I might be exposing myself to some
I might be
degree.
scared to answer it, so let's see.
So if I recall, the support vector machine had better precision and better recall, and then the neural network had better area under the curve.
Yes.
Is that possible?
Yeah, so it really depends on sort of the distribution of your data. And so I sort of mentioned that we optimized the candidate algorithm for recall. If we'd actually imposed some sort of threshold for precision on the candidate algorithm, you would actually see a lot less false or negative examples within the training set. So, obviously it's a little bit hard to say with certainty, but I would say that the support vector machine is doing slightly better because it's just taking the low-hanging fruit. It's doing a little bit better job at saying, this is not a dribble handoff, this is not a dribble handoff. And so if we have less not dribble handoffs in the training data, then it wouldn't have all of those sort of easy wins, if that makes sense. And so I think that its raw performance metrics are a little bit inflated as a result. So on a second pass, you go back, impose some sort of precision threshold on a candidate algorithm, you have a better distribution of true positives and true negatives, then you would expect the SVM to have less low-hanging fruit, and the neural network would likely then outstep it.
Yeah, great presentation. I guess my question/comment comes into all the work that it looks like has been done into stitching together the entire pipeline. I know you had the manual event data tracking being a big undertaking. Is there a way to like automate that, or is there a wish list you have in terms of like getting more than 43 games and being able to understand this from a broader perspective?
Second Spectrum wants to let me use their data. That would be awesome. So yeah, as lowly researchers, we don't have access to a lot of cutting edge things. As a result, the Sport View is the last public available data set. It's from 2015-16. That's why we see like Kobe and Tyson Chandler and stuff in those profiles, because they were obviously more relevant a few years ago. So it would be really great to have probably the more updated data. It might make things a little bit easier. Finding broadcast games is the other side of that was pretty difficult. A lot of similar research looks at visualizations of the tracking data for the actual analysis. And that, especially with dribble handoffs, when you're dealing with like fakes and stuff like that, it's very difficult to just look at dots moving around a screen and say like that was a fake dribble handoff. So it felt really important, personally and as a research team, to look at people playing basketball. So yeah, if I could find more broadcast games from that, it would be a lot easier too. So yeah, it's a lot of time spent on the internet trying to find grainy streams of Sacramento Kings games from January of 2015. So lots of fun.
So just one follow-up to one of Brian's points. If you think about you could actually, in addition to getting more data, so you don't have so many, as you put it, easy wins, right? You could just impose more structure on the neural net, right? Where you just give it some of that information essentially, so it's sort of a more fair horse race, if that's what's going on.
Yeah.
Which would be another way to do it, and then you just evaluate on the criteria above and beyond that, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think just our personal angle and what I find most interesting, the classification was a little bit of a means to an end, in that what we're really most concerned with is how do we represent these dynamic actions that are constantly shifting in such a way that we can try to find those emerging patterns and maybe like find those little cracks in strategy. So there was quite a bit of work obviously put into making those classification models performant enough that we could start to automate and pass those things along. But they were sort of a means to an end there, and a lot of the bulk of the work was probably getting those working well enough so we can start doing some of the cool cluster analysis stuff.
Sure,
But,
makes sense.
Yeah, no, you're totally fair.
And that's sort of at a broader level, I imagine you want to use this kind of framework to look at other sorts of actions that you see in a game. And I'm wondering my guess is you're probably working on that, but is there commonality in that, some of the things you learned in looking at screening versus, handoffs that you could apply to other sorts of similar situations where you could use kind of the same, in other words, you're going to get information from similar types of situations. They're not the same sort of strategies, but is that something you're looking at, sort of like a mega model of these
absolutely.
things?
So I mean, basketball is a very complicated game. It's also kind of a very simple game. Like you pass, you shoot, you screen. There's really not all that much else. So a lot of the actions are somewhat similar in that type of, so I think off-ball actions in particular would be really interesting to drill into, and sort of those screenings that occur. So we saw in the Hornets example how we actually have a preceding off-ball screen with a simultaneous off-ball screen that sort of bookends our dribble handoff. And the dribble handoff is intended to create that space in the driving lane so we can hit that backdoor pass. So being able to layer on additionally to try to determine those off-ball actions, how effective they are, when we should time them, sequence them in relation to everything else that's happening. But then furthermore, you can take this past basketball, like fundamentally, what we're really proposing is a way of encoding trajectories and passing that into, these little distillate pieces to a deep learning. So you could look at any other sport that's using trajectories. You could look at plane travel and all the flights between, London and Paris over a certain time period. And then there maybe we're concerned more about fuel efficiency or flight time as opposed to points per possession or a delta and court realty. So it's really more about the nuts and bolts of how we take very noisy, complicated trajectory data and get it into a nice piecemeal input to our deep learning models.
Very cool. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Are we?
All right, fantastic. Well, I really appreciate it, guys. This is literally a dream come true, so thank you.